For years, investigators have documented disturbing accounts of children left home alone, stories that did not emerge as urban legends but as late testimonies collected in adulthood. This documentary reconstructs 4 real cases in which the absence of adults opened space for something far darker. The first case took place in a house far too large for a 12-year-old boy. At the time, his parents believed they were leaving their child under safe supervision. What they did not know was that this decision would trigger one of the most terrifying nights ever reported in childhood home invasion accounts. According to later statements, the older brother left the house after convincing the boy to keep it a secret. The promise of temporary freedom seemed harmless. No cameras, no cell phone, no immediate way to contact the outside world. Just a child, a silent house, and night falling. The boy reported that the first signs of unease did not come from the horror movie he was watching, but from the natural sounds of the house itself. Creaks, groans, wind against the windows. To a child alone, every noise seemed intentional, as if the house itself were watching. Frightened, he turned off the television and ran to his bedroom. The sensation, common in childhood reports, was that of being chased by something unseen. An irrational fear, at least at first. What he did not know was that night, the danger was not imaginary. Hours later, already in bed, he heard the front door close. He assumed his brother had returned, but the footsteps did not follow the usual pattern. They did not go upstairs. They wandered through the house, pausing far too long to be normal. Looking out the window, the boy noticed the absence of his brother's car. That was the moment fear turned into real panic. With no personal phone and no courage to leave the bedroom, he realized he was truly alone with someone unknown inside the house. He locked the bedroom door, aware that the lock was fragile. He then chose to hide inside the small built-in closet. Curled up in the darkness, he tried to control his breathing while listening to footsteps slowly approaching down the hallway. Minutes later, the doorknob turned. The bedroom door opened. The intruder entered. The boy heard objects being moved, drawers opening, the floorboards creaking under the weight of someone who should not have been there. Every second felt like a final judgment. The intruder remained long enough to search the room. At one point, something heavy was dragged across the floor. The boy believed he would be discovered. Only after the footsteps faded did he remain hidden for hours, unsure if he would survive the night. Only hours later did the brother return, calling out for the boy. His voice was confused and irritated. When the child emerged from hiding, it became clear the brother had not been there earlier. The confirmation came when they saw the room in disarray. Together, they searched the house. Drawers open, electronics missing, doors unlocked. The police were called immediately. The report indicated an opportunistic break-in, but noted something unusual. The intruder had moved through areas where children were sleeping without urgency. The parents arrived at dawn. The father reacted with fury upon learning the older son had abandoned the house. The mother, in shock, focused only on the fact that the boy was alive. The trauma, however, had already taken root and would follow him for decades. The second case occurred in a small town where nearly everyone knew one another. The victim was even younger, living with grandparents. Here, the threat did not come from a stranger, but from someone woven into the family's routine, trusted and familiar. The neighbor was considered a friend. He drank with the adults, helped with repairs, attended gatherings. That specific night, he carefully observed who was home and who was not. He waited for the exact moment when the child would be alone. When he knocked on the door, he used familiarity as a weapon. The child recognized the voice and felt safe. Upon opening the door, there was no immediate alarm. Only after the man entered, intoxicated and aggressive, did the atmosphere shift abruptly. Without warning, the man grabbed the child and took a knife from the kitchen. The threats were direct, quiet, and real. Any attempt to scream would be punished. The terror of that moment was not remembered by words, but by tone and steel against skin. The sound of the grandparents' car interrupted the attack. The aggressor tried to maintain control, but was confronted by the grandfather's immediate fury. A struggle followed. The man was forced out of the house amid shouting and violence. Curiously, no formal police report was filed. The aggressor was never seen again. Years later, the victim questioned the grandmother about that night. Her response was evasive. The grandfather had gone hunting shortly afterward, something highly unusual at that hour. Investigators note that in small towns, silence also tells stories. The absence of official records does not erase events. Sometimes it simply means justice occurred far from reports, where certain problems disappear without leaving a trace. The third case took place in 2020, during spring break. A 15-year-old teenager was home alone while his parents were out of town. The night seemed ordinary until he received an unexpected call from a distant school acquaintance, someone who rarely reached out. The request was unusual, to let another friend stay over for the night. The insistence sounded desperate. The teenager refused several times until he gave in impulsively. No explicit threat was made, but the tone suggested urgency, as if something was about to spiral. When they arrived, the guest's behavior raised immediate concern. Empty stare, disjointed phrases, unsettling gestures. Before leaving, the driver pleaded with him not to do that thing. The warning was vague, but the fear behind it was unmistakably real. As soon as they were alone, the guest asked if all the doors were locked. The silence that followed was oppressive. Then a rigid smile appeared, paired with a slow, raised arm, as if he were rehearsing something repeatedly in his mind. In the kitchen, he drifted toward the drawer holding the knives. The teenager reacted instinctively, slamming the drawer shut before a blade could be taken. There was no emotional response, only a prolonged stare that made time feel suspended. An improvised escape followed, a suggestion to walk to the park. The real plan was distance. After locking the door, the teenager called his brother and removed every knife from the house. The realization was clear. Disaster had been avoided by seconds. Minutes later, family and friends arrived. The visitor rambled about conspiracies, persecution, and unseen forces. Later, it was revealed he had been reading a manifesto, convinced he needed to kill himself or someone else that very night. The incident was later linked to drug-induced psychotic episodes. No crime occurred, but investigators emphasized that the absence of victims resulted from early awareness. One ignored detail would have been enough to turn the night into tragedy. The fourth and final case involved a 10-year-old child left alone for a few hours. The neighborhood was quiet. The afternoon was bright. Nothing suggested danger until, between basketball shots, something drew attention to an upstairs window. A silhouette stood behind half-closed blinds in an empty bedroom. It was not a reflection, not a shadow. The house was supposed to be empty. The child ran inside, shouting for someone. A reply came from upstairs, calling his name in an unfamiliar voice. The child froze instantly. The voice belonged to no family member. It was calm, almost practiced. Panicking, he fled outside, grabbed the landline phone, and called his mother, begging her to return. Police were contacted moments later. When officers arrived, they searched every room. Closets, attic, bedrooms. No one was found. No signs of forced entry. The case was treated as a misunderstanding, yet the detail of the voice calling the child by name was logged officially. That night, sleep came with difficulty. Hours later, the child woke to a faint sound. Sitting up in bed, he saw a dark shape standing inside his room. It was not a dream. The figure moved and terror struck instantly. Before any reaction was possible, the figure sprinted to the window, opened it, and jumped out. The sound woke the parents, who rushed in. The father attempted pursuit but found no one. Police returned to file a second report. Investigators proposed disturbing possibilities. The intruder knew the house. He knew the child's name. He watched during the day and waited for night. Nothing was stolen. No violence occurred. The purpose appeared to be presence and surveillance alone. When analyzing all 4 cases, patterns emerge. Large homes, absent adults, unlocked doors, misplaced trust. In each instance, danger manifested quietly, not as imagined monsters, but as real people exploiting moments of vulnerability. Forensic psychologists note that children sense threats before adults do. Sounds, silences, behaviors out of place register instinctively. When adults return, the danger has often passed, leaving only trauma and unanswered questions. None of these cases made headlines. No major arrests followed. Still, the accounts remain preserved in interviews, files, and memories. Stories resurfacing years later, told by adults who still recall childhood fear with disturbing clarity. The psychological impact lasted decades. Insomnia, hypervigilance, fear of silence. Every survivor described the same detail. Not faces or voices, but the sound of footsteps where no one should have been. These 4 real accounts reveal an unsettling truth. True horror does not come from the supernatural, but from broken safety. When a child is left alone, danger does not announce itself. It enters quietly, observes closely, and sometimes leaves no proof behind. Criminology experts state that intrusions like these are rarely random. There is prior observation, routine testing, and patient waiting. Children left alone represent silent targets. They react differently, report inconsistently, and are often doubted after the fact. In 3 of the 4 cases, entry occurred without forced break-in. Unlocked doors, misplaced trust, or familiarity created access. The failure was not the brief absence of adults, but the belief that nothing could happen in that short window. Investigators emphasize that silence afterward is part of the pattern. When nothing serious occurs, events are minimized. No injury, no crime. Yet intention does not vanish. It simply retreats, waiting for another opportunity elsewhere. In the first case, the intruder lingered inside the child's room. In the last, he waited until night to reveal himself. In both, emotional control determined survival. A scream or sudden movement might have changed everything. Later interviews reveal a shared detail. All survivors remember the sound of footsteps, not faces or voices, but the weight of someone walking where they should not be. That sound becomes fixed, returning years later in moments of complete silence. Psychologists classify these events as surveillance trauma. The victim is not attacked, but loses the sense of safety. Home stops being refuge. Childhood ends there, replaced by an early awareness of human threat. None of the intruders were formally identified. Some vanished, others were never reported. The absence of legal closure does not erase the damage. It reinforces the idea that protection failed when it mattered most. When reviewing these 4 cases, what disturbs most is proximity to disaster. Seconds, minor choices, a single door. Horror was present, tangible, yet withdrew for reasons that will never be fully understood. Today, the survivors share these stories as warnings, not to incite fear, but to remind that danger rarely announces itself. It studies routines, learns names, and waits for moments when no one believes harm is possible. These are not stories about empty houses. They are stories about broken trust, about children who learned too early that being alone does not mean being safe, and about presences that entered, observed, and left only fear behind. Beyond the events themselves, investigators focus on what they reveal. Children left alone face not only immediate fear, but a lasting fracture of trust. The home transforms from shelter into uncertain territory. Psychological archives show that memories formed under threat are stored with unusual clarity: sounds, smells, lighting. Decades later, survivors recount details vividly, as if time never truly moved forward. These incidents are described as incomplete encounters. The crime does not finish, but intent existed. Absence of violence means interruption, not safety. Something failed, someone retreated, and that uncertainty deepens the fear. In every case, chance played the final role. An early return, a delayed decision, a reflexive reaction. None of the children were prepared. Survival depended on fragile circumstances too weak to be called luck. Criminologists warn that intruders observing children operate in near silence. They avoid confrontation. They test limits. When unnoticed, they return. What unsettles most is not what happened, but what may have happened before. Some survivors report lifelong sensations of being watched. This is not paranoia, but conditioned memory. The brain learns that danger can exist even when everything appears calm, familiar, and quiet. Experts emphasize that children rarely fabricate such consistent narratives. When patterns align across unrelated accounts, the most likely explanation is lived experience. Adult dismissal often becomes the greatest failure. These 4 cases survived because the victims eventually spoke. Many others never did. Silence does not mean nothing occurred. It often means fear outweighed the ability to describe what was lived. Reviewing these records makes one truth clear. Danger rarely manifests as immediate attack. It observes, calculates, and waits. Childhood vulnerability offers exactly what predators seek: routine, trust, and limited resistance. These stories do not demand panic but awareness. Children left alone do not face imaginary monsters. They face real people, human errors, and misjudgments. Horror does not scream. It enters quietly, watches closely, and sometimes leaves unseen. When revisiting these cases, investigators note that none of them began with violence. Everything started with complete normality. Routine days, established trust, and the temporary absence of adults. Terror does not arrive abruptly. It infiltrates slowly, exploiting every overlooked gap. Criminologists point out that predators rarely improvise. They observe schedules, study behavior, and test reactions. When they encounter silence, they advance. When resistance or risk appears, they retreat. Lack of confrontation does not mean lack of intent. In the first case, the intruder calmly explored the house. In the second, he targeted someone who trusted him. In the third, he attempted isolation. In the fourth, he remained hidden for hours. 4 methods, the same opportunity exploited. Experts stress that many intruders do not seek objects alone. They seek control, observation, and psychological dominance. Entering a home occupied by a child without being noticed already represents a form of silent power to them. These events leave invisible marks. Adults who live through them report difficulty trusting, compulsive checking of doors and windows, and deep discomfort when alone. Childhood ends, but the reflex remains active. None of these cases received full explanation. There were no confessions, trials, or official closure. What remained were memories and unanswered questions. Who were these people? How often had they been there before? Silence magnifies fear. Documenting these cases is not exploitation, but pattern recognition. Danger rarely appears obvious. It disguises itself in familiar voices, minimized behaviors, and quick decisions made without reflection. Investigators reinforce that listening to children is essential. The historic mistake has always been dismissing their accounts. In these cases, survival came precisely because someone sensed something was wrong before it was too late. These stories close a cycle, but offer no comfort. They reveal how fragile safety truly is. When a child is alone, danger does not need to knock. It may already be watching from within. At this stage, what remains is not relief, but unease. These cases do not end with clear answers. They end with adult survivors trying to understand how close they came to irreversible harm while still children. In later interviews, all described the same feeling, certainty of being watched before that day, a lingering stare, a repeated presence nearby, a strangeness ignored. The final event was merely the moment awareness arrived. Criminologists explain that predators do not appear suddenly. They test limits gradually, a knock, a quiet entry, an odd question. Each action measures vigilance and reaction before any definitive move. When the plan fails, they vanish. They change area, routine, target. This explains why many are never identified. They leave no visible trace, only fractured memories in those who realize danger too late. All four survivors agree on one point. Fear was not immediate. It grew slowly, like an internal warning, a feeling dismissed as childish exaggeration that ultimately became the only available defense. Experts warn that adults often overtrust normalcy. They believe homes, neighborhoods, and routines provide protection. These cases prove otherwise. Danger respects no address, age, or time. It depends solely on opportunity. The silence surrounding these stories is no coincidence. Many families prefer forgetting or minimizing. Admitting risk is admitting failure. Yet forgetting does not erase the event. It merely transfers the burden to the survivor. Documentaries like this exist to record what almost happened, not to shock, but to remind that the line between safety and tragedy can be invisible, especially when children are left alone, trusting everything will be fine. The accounts presented here are real, verified through direct testimony and indirect records. There is no supernatural exaggeration, only ordinary people, ordinary decisions, and consequences that could have been fatal with one difference. In the end, one conclusion remains. Being alone as a child is not just solitude, it is vulnerability. And true terror is not imaginary monsters in the dark, but knowing a real person may have been there, watching, waiting, in silence. When revisiting these accounts in adulthood, survivors speak not only of fear, but of premature clarity. Something was learned too early, that the world does not warn before crossing boundaries, and that danger can appear precisely when everything seems normal. Specialists state that such events shape future behavior. Many develop strict safety habits, others avoid being alone. This is not weakness, it is adaptation. The mind learned in childhood that constant vigilance can mean survival. None of these children received training or preparation. They were left trusting the environment around them. Houses, neighborhoods, and schedules failed as barriers. What remained was instinct, reacting before logic could process the real threat. Investigators note that prevented crimes rarely appear in statistics. They do not show up in charts or public records. Still, they represent real danger. Each of these cases demonstrates how violence can exist even when it does not fully materialize. The silence that followed is as disturbing as the events themselves. Families moved on, neighbors forgot, intruders vanished. Only the victims carried the memories, replaying every decision made during those solitary hours. The common element was not bad luck or coincidence. It was opportunity. Children alone, predictable environments, and briefly absent adults. Danger does not require long absences. It needs only short windows that go unnoticed. Documenting these stories is an act of prevention, not to spread fear, but to dismantle the myth of automatic safety. Child protection depends not on silence, but on awareness and the recognition that real risks exist. Survivors agree on one essential truth. Surviving did not mean winning, it meant escaping, a subtle but profound difference. The terror did not end when the intruder left, but when they learned to live with what almost happened. Each account presented here confirms an uncomfortable reality. Danger rarely presents itself as an explicit threat. It observes, tests, and waits. When it fails, it disappears. When it succeeds, it leaves irreversible consequences. By hearing these stories, the audience is not invited to irrational fear, but to awareness, because true terror does not live in legends. It lives in real, ordinary, silent situations when no one believes something bad could happen. At the end of this investigation, there are no identified villains and no complete answers. There are only fragments of truth preserved by those who survived. Memories marked by the real fear of not knowing who was nearby. What makes these accounts disturbing is not what happened, but what almost happened. Violence existed as a concrete possibility, suspended by seconds, instinctive decisions, or coincidences impossible to predict. These episodes show that danger does not require extreme settings. It appears in ordinary homes, normal afternoons, and seemingly safe nights. Threats do not announce themselves. They exploit trust, routine, and disbelief. For survivors, the past never fully faded. Every silent house, unlocked door, or unexpected noise activates old memories, not as visible trauma, but as constant vigilance learned far too early. Investigators emphasize that listening to such stories is not morbid curiosity. It is prevention. Real experiences serve as late warnings, reminding us that child safety must be built intentionally, not assumed. When children are left alone, they face more than solitude. They face human unpredictability, people who observe, calculate, and exploit minimal gaps. Risk is not constant, but when it appears, it arrives without warning. The silence surrounding these cases is as frightening as the events themselves. Many were never reported, investigated, or discussed. They remained buried until adulthood allowed understanding of what was truly at stake. This documentary does not seek panic, but awareness. True horror does not exist in fiction, but in real moments that nearly became tragedies and survive only in the memory of those who stood close to the worst. Each story here confirms a troubling truth. Being alone as a child is a real vulnerability. The line between safety and danger can be invisible, crossed without sound, without warning, and without witnesses. These were 4 real childhood stories of solitude and silent danger. They did not end in tragedy, but they could have, and perhaps that is what makes them so disturbing. The terror did not win, but it came close enough to be remembered.